whenever January rolls around, I tend to think about the Beatles and the Get Back documentary series, and it gives me this excuse to watch Get Back a few more times. And that's exactly what I just got done doing the other day. I watched Get Back a few more times. I mean, and why not? You know, it's the Beatles. And that time in January of 1969 was just so fascinating. You know, every time I watch it, I see something different or I learn something new. And this time when I watched it, you know, I took a couple notes of a few things that struck me, you know, and I just want to have a chat about that right now, not a deep dive, but a chat, you know, and of just episode 1. And you know, in episode 1, when we see them for the very first time, first of all, we see, you know, George, and then John and George, and then Ringo joins them. And then lastly, Paul shows up, and now you have all 4 of them there, and they're kind of, you know, huddling close together, you know, on that big, huge, you know, cavernous stage, you know, that looks so cold and, you know, dank to me. It's like, I'm sorry, I'm just going to, I just have to set that aside for a minute. But anyway, there they are kind of huddled together, trying to be Beatles again and lock in with one another. And it seems to me that they're just kind of blocking everything out around them, you know, everybody and everything. And it made me think of one of my very favorite quotes about the Beatles. And this is a quote from Chris Thomas. And actually, he is quoting George Martin. Him and George Martin, Chris Thomas and George Martin were working together on the Beatles' White Album with the Beatles. And George Martin had to go on vacation or something, and he leaves Chris Thomas in charge. And Chris Thomas remembers what George Martin said to him. He says, this isn't verbatim, but he said something like this. He says, there will be 1 Beatle there fine, 2 Beatles great, 3 Beatles fantastic. But the minute the 4 of them are there, that is when the inexplicable, charismatic thing happens. The special magic no one's been able to explain. It will be very friendly between you and them, but you'll be aware of this inexplicable presence. And Chris Thomas says, you know, that's exactly what happened. You know, and I can kind of see that. That's what's going on there on that Twickenham soundstage. They're kind of keeping everybody at arm's length, you know, in this very, you know, weird space when nothing is working and all this pressure is on them. Yeah, they put the pressure on themselves. You know, this is them. They want to do this. And of course, they're going to do a good job. Of course, it's all going to work out great. You know, but it seems to me, you know, that they just don't get any support. Well, at least not any good support. And, you know, the equipment's not working. Nobody knows what's going on. You know, nobody has any ideas. You know, they're all kind of more pressure on the Beatles, something they really don't need at this point in time. You know, their professional life and their personal lives, so much going on. It's just so messy there. You know, I don't know what to tell you. So it just kind of upsets me every time I see them there, you know, all the pressure on them. Just like when we see Paul. Paul's over there and he's talking to George Martin and Michael Lindsay Hogg. They're over off to the side. And this is right after George Harrison said, you know, the acoustics aren't so great here. You know, so all of a sudden everybody's going to kind of go like, what is happening? Why are we here? And so that's what they're talking about over there. And they're saying, hey, Paul, you're going to do it here. You're going to go someplace else. What's going to happen? More pressure. And Paul's just kind of going, I don't know. Maybe we will and maybe we won't. And as far as I'm concerned, like that's the tagline for all of Get Back, you know, with the Beatles, like maybe we will and maybe we won't. Obviously it turns out great, but you know, but between then and the end, it's like utter like chaos. You know, the Beatles, they're doing a good job. Okay. They're doing the best that they can, you know, under all this pressure. And all the chaos around them and all the stuff isn't working and nobody coming up with great ideas. They're just not getting the great. Of course, Mal and Neil, a lot of great support. George Martin doing what he can, but he's not in power. Okay. All these other people like have the power and they're just kind of sitting back and like, okay, magically it's just going to happen. Okay. Beatles just make it happen. And the Beatles are doing their best. You know, there is good stuff that happens. Okay. And one of the good things that does happen is, you know, when they're sitting there and they're trying to come up with songs for the project and they're looking through their old catalog, you know, like Just Fun and One After 909, one great thing that happens with George Harrison, he plays the intro to Thinking of Linking to Paul and Paul tries to join in. Paul doesn't quite remember, you know, the song. And so he gives up pretty quickly and nobody laughs about it, you know, and he shakes it off. And it made me think, you know, this is exactly what George Harrison did, you know, in 25 years later. George Harrison plays that guitar intro to Thinking of Linking to Paul to kind of get things going. And they're laughing about it. I don't know. I wonder if this is just George kind of saying, hey, remember when to Paul? Because Paul and George were at the cinema together when they saw that Link furniture commercial that gave Paul the idea for the song Thinking of Linking. So I don't know, maybe this is just George kind of reminiscing with Paul, saying, remember this song, this is fun. Let's just play this song. At least that's just me thinking that. I don't know for sure, but sure seems like that to me. And then I noticed something that I probably should have noticed a long time ago when Paul is there and he's on his bass and he's conjuring Get Back. And you have George and Ringo over here. They're on Ringo's drum riser and they're just leaning into Paul, kind of giving him some support, ready to accompany him to kind of fill in this song as it develops. It makes me think of the three of them working, like 25 years later on Real Love, Freeze a Bird, and Now and Then. I don't know why I never really saw that before. I don't know. It's just so poignant when I saw that. And can we also talk about Ringo being a bloody pro, back then and now even? Ringo's always a pro. And if we also talk a little bit about Ringo's soft power, and what do I mean by soft power? It's that Ringo being steady, just clapping along, here I am, I'm here for you. And when he's doing that, he's just accumulating power, okay? Meaning like, okay, now you guys owe me because I'm always here, I'm putting up with all this crap and now you're gonna owe me. And that's exactly what goes on all throughout Get Back. I mean, for crying out loud, the whole thing revolves around Ringo's schedule, the shooting schedule of Magic Christian. And then we also see Paul earlier writing this song, Carry That Weight, for Ringo. Now, it doesn't turn out to be a Ringo song, but Ringo certainly leads the chorus, when you listen to it on Abbey Road. And then George Harrison helps Ringo with Octopus's Garden. And we also hear Ringo kind of chastising John when they're arguing about, should we go away in a boat? What are we going to do and all that? And Ringo kind of backs up, checks John a little bit. And he says, I seen it, John. I went to the premiere. I thought you were great. I just love hearing that each and every time. And everybody laughs. Who else is going to be yelling at John like that? Only Ringo. And then there's this very beautiful scene that's also a little bit frustrating for me on January 9th, where George is on his acoustic guitar and he's playing the Dylan song, Mama, You've Been on My Mind. I think everybody loves that part. But for me, it's frustrating because there's just not enough of it. Okay, it's great to see Paul and Linda, etc. And I don't mind seeing John, and I do want to see everybody kind of gathered around. I want to see the other guys. Are they listening to George? What's actually happening? And I want to see George. I want to see George on the acoustic. Okay, I want to see that. And for me, that's the frustrating part for me. It's a very beautiful moment, and I want more of it because we know, like the very next day, George is going to blow away. and again, as far as George quitting, I'm sure there's a bunch of reasons. And it made me think of the reasons why Ringo quit the year before during the White Album. Ringo always said that it was because he didn't feel like he was part of the group. Everybody else was friends. Everybody else was getting along. He just didn't feel connected. He wasn't part of the group. And also he wasn't playing very well. I bet you anything George was feeling exactly the same way. I'm not playing very well. I can't get a good sound. I'm trying all these guitars, got the stupid wah-wah pedal, it's not really working out so great, and also like you guys are together and you're all doing great. You're all having fun. And I'm just sitting here, it's not working out so great for me. So I think that, George and Ringo kind of on the same page as far as like some of the reasons, why they quit the band. I don't know. I don't think it's super complicated. And while we do know that George joins the band again, they get their stuff together and they go up on the roof and everything works out super duper. I've always thought it was very interesting that at the end of episode 1, you're still feeling a little bit of tension, okay, even though it all works out at the end. So that was very well done. So thank you so much for being here with me today for my little Get Back chat of episode 1. And until next time, peace and love one another. Take care. Michael Lindsay Hogg says something funny, and I don't think he meant it to be funny. It's funny to me anyway. They're all there sitting around talking about Magic Alex, and Michael Lindsay Hogg asks, where did you get Alexis from? Almost like he's saying, did you pick him up at the store, the side of the road? Where did this idiot come from?